There is a housing complex north of Tokyo where you could grow old, get sick, die alone inside your apartment, and remain undiscovered for weeks. Not because the building is abandoned, because there are thousands of people living around you. More than 10,000 residents live inside this enormous district of nearly identical concrete apartment blocks. Some of these buildings are now more than half a century old. Entire generations have lived and died inside them. Many of the young families who once filled these apartments are gone. And the people left behind are getting older. In some parts of the complex, elderly residents live alone, surviving on fixed incomes, in apartments they can afford because almost nobody younger wants to live there anymore. Rent can be surprisingly cheap. But there is a reason. Because what was once one of Japan's greatest housing success stories has slowly turned into something much darker. A giant concrete experiment, built to solve a national housing crisis. A neighborhood designed to create a better life. And today a place where Japan's aging population has become so concentrated that an entirely new economy has grown around what happens when people grow old alone. Cleaning companies, insurance products, welfare services, home care businesses, renovation companies, property developers. An entire industry now makes money from a problem these apartment blocks were never designed to solve. And the most disturbing part, this isn't just the story of one housing complex. It could be a preview of what happens when an entire country gets old. Stay until the end, because we'll also look at Japan's most extreme vision for solving the housing problem. A proposed tower so enormous, it was designed to hold an entire city inside one structure. But first we need to go back to the place where this nightmare began. The district is called Takashima-dera. And when it was built, it was supposed to represent the future. The dream that became a trap. Takashima-dera sits in Itabashi Ward, on the northern edge of Tokyo. Today it is a vast landscape of concrete apartment blocks. But before the towers arrived, much of this area was open land and farmland. Then Japan changed. After World War II, Japan faced one of the biggest housing shortages in its history. Cities had been destroyed, millions of people needed somewhere to live, and Japan's population was growing. The country needed homes. Fast. The solution was something called danshi. Large-scale apartment developments built to house huge numbers of families at relatively low cost. They were efficient, they were modern, and for millions of Japanese families, they represented something completely new. Running water, private bathrooms, modern kitchens, separate rooms, a home of your own. For young couples in post-war Japan, getting an apartment in a new danshi could feel like winning the future. And Takashima-dera was built at massive scale. Construction began in the early 1972s. Block after block rose from the ground. Concrete towers, long walkways, green spaces, shopping areas, clinics, community facilities. Everything was designed around one simple idea. You could build an entire community from scratch. Young families moved in. Children played outside. Parents commuted into Tokyo. The apartments filled, and for a while the experiment worked almost perfectly. But there was one problem nobody planned for. The people who moved in stayed for decades. Their children grew up. Their children moved away. And their parents got old. The same apartments that once represented Japan's future slowly became homes for the generation that built that future. And eventually, the complex began changing. Not suddenly, quietly, one apartment at a time, one elderly resident at a time, one empty apartment at a time. Japan's population stopped growing. Then it started aging. Young people increasingly wanted newer apartments, better locations, and easier access to central Tokyo. But many of the original residents couldn't simply leave. Moving costs money, new apartments cost more, and retirement income doesn't stretch as far as it once did. So they stayed. The cheap rent that once made the complex attractive slowly became something else. A reason people couldn't afford to leave. And that is how a successful housing project slowly became a demographic trap. What life looks like inside. Imagine waking up in the same apartment you moved into 50 years ago. The same hallway, the same concrete balcony, the same view. The shops nearby are still familiar. The clinic is close. The grocery store is within walking distance. For an elderly person, that convenience can be essential. You don't have to travel far. You don't need to navigate the center of Tokyo. Everything you need is close, but there is another side to that convenience. the less reason you have to leave your neighborhood, the easier it becomes for your world to get smaller. Your children live somewhere else. Your friends become sick. Some move away. Some die. And eventually, days can pass without meaningful contact with another person. That is where the real nightmare begins. Not with the concrete. Not with the architecture. With isolation. Japan even has a word associated with one of the darkest outcomes of this problem. Kodakushi. A lonely death. Someone dies alone, and is not discovered for an extended period. And as Japan's population ages, an entire industry has emerged around what happens afterward. This is where the billion-dollar business begins. Because death doesn't stop the economic system. In some cases, it creates a new one. The business nobody wanted to exist. Imagine you own an apartment. Your tenant lives alone. One day, they stop answering the phone. Nobody notices. Weeks pass. Eventually someone discovers what happened. Now the apartment cannot simply be rented again. It may need to be professionally cleaned. Furniture may need to be removed. Damaged flooring may need replacement. Walls may need restoration. Odors may need specialized treatment. The property may need renovation before another tenant is willing to move in. That created demand for a specialized industry. Japan now has companies focused on restoring properties after unattended deaths. These aren't ordinary cleaning jobs. They can require specialized equipment, protective procedures, disposal services, deep cleaning, restoration, and property renovation. And that is only one part of the economy surrounding Japan's aging population. There are also home care companies, meal delivery services, medical support businesses, emergency monitoring services, senior relocation companies, estate clearing services, insurance products, funeral services, apartment renovation businesses, and property companies trying to figure out what to do with thousands of aging buildings, full of aging residents. Japan's demographic crisis is becoming an economy, and places like Takashima-dera are where you can see that economy forming in real time. The apartment complex isn't necessarily generating billions of dollars by itself. The bigger business is the ecosystem created around the problems concentrated inside places like it. And that's what makes this story so important. The nightmare isn't the business model. The nightmare is what the business model is responding to. The economics of getting old. When Takashima-dera was built, the economic model was simple. Build thousands of apartments, fill them with young families, collect rent, maintain the buildings, repeat. But 50 years later, everything changed. The original residents are older. Their incomes are often lower. Their children don't necessarily want the apartments. And attracting younger residents can be difficult when newer housing exists elsewhere. So the business problem becomes much more complicated. How do you maintain old concrete buildings? How do you renovate apartments? How do you install elevators or accessibility features? How do you provide services for residents who can no longer manage stairs? How do you keep stores profitable when the population is shrinking? How do you replace tenants when fewer young families want to move in? And most importantly, who pays? That is where an aging apartment complex becomes more than a housing problem. It becomes a financial problem. Buildings need maintenance. Residents need services. Infrastructure gets older. Revenue can stagnate. Costs increase. And every year the demographic problem gets more expensive. For property owners and housing organizations, the challenge is enormous. Do you renovate? Do you demolish? Do you rebuild? Do you lower rents? Do you add services for elderly residents? Every option costs money. But ignoring the problem costs money too. And this is happening across Japan. Takashima-dera is simply one of the clearest examples of what happens when a massive housing project outlives the generation it was built for. When a community becomes a machine, there is something almost unsettling about the scale of these developments. Thousands of people, hundreds of buildings, nearly identical apartments, the same staircases, the same balconies, the same concrete walls repeated again and again. When these places were young, that scale was their greatest advantage. Mass production made housing affordable. Shared infrastructure made neighborhoods efficient. Large populations supported stores and services. But when the population gets older, the same scale creates a new problem. Every demographic change becomes concentrated. If thousands of young families move in at roughly the same time, thousands of people can also grow old at roughly the same time. The neighborhood ages together. The local economy ages with it. Schools lose students. Medical services become more important. Shops change their customers. Housing demand changes. And eventually, an apartment complex can become a demographic time capsule. A physical record of one generation. That is why Takashima-dera has become so fascinating to urban planners and researchers. It isn't just an old housing project. It's a concentrated version of Japan's demographic future. And that future is creating opportunities for businesses, because every problem eventually creates a market for someone trying to solve it. The companies profiting from the crisis. The first obvious winners are care businesses. As residents age, demand grows for people who can help with daily life, cleaning, cooking, medical visits, transportation, monitoring and emergency support. Then there are technology companies. Japan is increasingly interested in systems that can monitor elderly residents living alone. Sensors, emergency buttons, automated alerts, services designed to detect when something unusual happens. Because discovering a problem early is cheaper than dealing with the consequences later. Then come the property businesses. Old apartments represent a strange opportunity. Their locations may still be valuable. The buildings may be outdated. But the land underneath them can be worth far more than the aging structures sitting on top. That creates an entirely different business model. Redevelopment, demolition, reconstruction, new apartments, new residents, higher rents. The problem is that rebuilding a giant housing complex is not simple. Thousands of people may already live there. Many are elderly. Relocating them costs money. Negotiations take time. And the people who need affordable housing the most may be unable to afford what replaces it. So redevelopment creates a difficult question. When you rebuild a community, are you saving it? Or are you destroying the only affordable place its oldest residents can live? That conflict is where billions of dollars can eventually move. Between old housing, new development, elderly services, insurance, technology, and the massive cost of maintaining a country built for a younger population. Japan's other giant housing experiment, and Takashima-dera, isn't the only place where Japan pushed mass housing to the extreme. North of Tokyo, another enormous danshi project tells the same story from a different angle. Sokomatsubara Danshi. Completed during Japan's post-war housing boom, it represents another version of the same philosophy. Build at scale. Build fast. Give enormous numbers of people somewhere to live. Rows of nearly identical buildings stretch across the development. And just like Takashima-dera, its story changed as Japan changed. The problem with mass housing is that buildings can remain standing long after the economic conditions that created them disappear. A city can grow, then shrink. A population can boom, then age. A neighborhood designed for commuters can suddenly need hospitals and elderly services. The concrete doesn't care. The people inside it do. And this is why Japan's apartment crisis is becoming one of the most interesting business stories in the country. Because Japan is not simply building new homes. It is trying to figure out what to do with the homes it already built. Millions of them. The tower that tried to solve everything, but eventually, Japan's housing imagination went even further. What if the answer wasn't spreading cities across the landscape? What if you simply built upward? Far upward. The concept was called Sky Mile Tower, a proposed megastructure, designed for Tokyo Bay. A vertical city, homes, offices, schools, services. Potentially tens of thousands of people living inside one enormous structure. The proposed tower would have been taller than anything humans have ever built. It was an attempt to take the logic behind the danshi and push it to an extreme. Instead of building hundreds of apartment blocks across a district, put the entire city inside one structure. But Sky Mile Tower never became reality. It remained a concept, and perhaps that is fitting, because Japan's real housing problem was never simply how high to build. It was what happens afterward. What happens when the people inside grow old? What happens when population growth stops? What happens when the homes built for one generation have to serve another? A building can solve a housing crisis, but it can't solve demographic change. The real billion-dollar business. And that's the biggest lesson hidden inside Takashima-dera. Japan's largest apartment complexes weren't failures when they were built. In many ways they were extraordinary successes. They housed millions of people. They created modern communities. They helped fuel Japan's economic rise. The problem is that success lasted longer than the assumptions behind it. The apartments survived. The original residents survived. but the population around them changed. And now, Japan is spending enormous amounts of money dealing with the consequences, caring for elderly residents, maintaining old buildings, monitoring people living alone, cleaning apartments after unattended deaths, renovating aging homes, redeveloping entire districts, and building new technology to solve problems that didn't exist when these concrete towers were new. That is the billion-dollar business behind the nightmare. Not one company secretly making billions from an apartment complex, but an entire economy emerging from the consequences of Japan's aging housing experiment. Takashima Daira is what happens when a successful city freezes in time. The young families leave, the residents grow old, the buildings decay, and businesses slowly move in to solve every problem that follows. And that might be the most uncomfortable part of this entire story, because Japan isn't alone. Countries across the world are aging. Cities everywhere are filled with apartment buildings, constructed for populations that are changing faster than the buildings themselves. Which means the strange economy growing around Japan's aging housing crisis may not stay in Japan forever. It may be the beginning of an entirely new global industry. If this story changed how you look at apartment buildings, like the video and subscribe for more stories about the hidden businesses shaping the world around us. And let me know in the comments, would you rather grow old in a quiet apartment complex surrounded by thousands of strangers? Or leave the only home you've known for 50 years? Because in Japan that question is no longer theoretical. For thousands of people living inside these concrete cities, it's already their reality.